My name is Ramona Masacci. I'm an artist, a creator. I learned about modern monetary theory through Bernie Sanders' campaign. I wanted to understand his economic platform, which led me to his economic advisor, Stephanie Kelton. I started reading her work, and it intrinsically resonated with me. So I wanted everyone else to learn about it. I got together with my friends at Real Progressives, and we put together this book club. For 9 weeks, we read and discussed Stephanie Kelton's bestseller, The Deficit Myth. We started each session with passages from that week's chapter. Then a guest took questions from the attendees. You're about to watch the recording of the Q&A section. This week we covered Chapter 6, You're Entitled. Our guest, Rohan Grey, is an assistant professor of law at Wilmette University, the president of Modern Money Network, and a director of the National Jobs for All Network. On Twitter, he is at Rohan Grey. You can find his writings at rohangray.net. So we're going to go to our first question from Patrick. Is Patrick here? Okay, I'm going to ask. Oh, he is. Go for it, Patrick. You can unmute.
Hey, Rohan, thank you for coming back. And Ramona, thanks for having us back. So Rohan, my question is, in this chapter, Stephanie speaks about, the need to increase our real resources. And I was wondering if you could speak some on how would you recommend, what are ways that we can do that, and what are ways that we should increase our real resources?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I think is, and this is probably well-worn terrain for anyone who's this many chapters deep into Stephanie's book, is that a full employment economy functions fundamentally differently to a sub-full employment economy. So on one hand, you just have simply the output loss of millions and millions of people who could be working and who don't work. And there's a sort of famous joke that Nobel Prize winner James Tobin used to have, where he said it takes a lot of Harbinger triangles to fill an Oken gap. And it's a sort of joke for economists, because Harbinger triangles are the thing you study in your econ textbook as the dead weight loss from an inefficient market. And the Oken gap is the output loss from an economy not operating at full employment. And his point is that so many economists, so many microeconomists and others spend so much time worrying and obsessing about individual failures in particular markets that don't function efficiently, that they miss the big picture, that they miss that all those tiny little inefficiencies add up to a fraction of the overall possible real resource loss from just not running the economy at full employment. There's an argument to be made that even running the economy beyond full employment, that is to say, really straining at the seams, is actually the best way to do it. You think about sort of the human body, the way you build muscles is you sort of, push the muscles past the point where they can handle, and then they regrow even stronger, right? That if you think about World War II, when we were running a hot economy, not just full employment, but hot, where we were bursting at the seams, we doubled real output in 6 years. And when you're kind of having an economy where people can leave shitty jobs, right, where exploitation is lower, where not only do employers have to compete for jobs, but workers can choose to do jobs that they find fulfilling. And you've got a kind of general industrial policy along the lines of the Green New Deal. I think you have a very different kind of economy in terms of real resource production. More broadly, there's a question of economic planning, right? You have to actually plan the kinds of resources and investments you want to create, right? And people like Mariana Mazzucato have written a lot about what she calls mission-oriented investment, right? And you can think about that, everything from we're going to eliminate poverty, we're going to eliminate hunger, we're going to put a man on the moon, right? We're going to increase the capacity to administer payments, even as something as basic as that. And that can include everything from building infrastructure to building human organizational capacity. But one area that's perhaps under thought of in this area, or not that many people spend time thinking about, which was an area that particularly dear to my heart, is around information. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, famously said, when you have an apple and I have an apple and we swap, we both still have one apple. If you have an idea and I have an idea and we swap, we both have two ideas, right? So that the economics of scarce real resources or limited real resources don't apply exactly to information and ideas. But the biggest thing we have holding us back in that space is intellectual property, copyright, patents, right? Even progressives often end up finding themselves on the side of copyright because they identify with, for example, a poor artist who currently only makes money off their intellectual property. But there are other ways to remunerate creative workers that don't require enclosing via property rights access to information that could be made available to literally everybody who has access to a digital device and could press Control-C, Control-V. So my old law professor, who I take a lot of inspiration from, Eben Moglen, famously said, the great moral question of the 21st century is that if we can give all knowledge, all culture, all science to everybody for the price that it costs to give it to one person, why would it be moral to ever exclude anyone? If we could eliminate ignorance tomorrow, any child that wanted to learn maths could. Why would it ever be moral to keep 7 billion brains from growing? And I think of that as an elementary school teacher, as a musician, right? And as someone that now works in academia. If we released all knowledge and all intellectual property and we created a system of open science where anybody that contributes to science can share those results with everybody else, I think we would find the kinds of real resource constraints we're experiencing in other spaces to drastically reduce it in response. Because what we often do now via analog means, I think the last 12 months, but the last 20 years before that are a pretty good lesson that there are a lot of things that we do with real resources that could be done digitally. And maybe not exactly the same, maybe not perfectly, but a pretty good approximation that we could find that we could give to everybody in a device that's big enough to fit in your pocket. So those are the big real resource constraint limits to me, is full employment and full information, or full culture or full knowledge. And if we have those two things, we're running a hot economy like that for 5 years, I think we'll find a lot of these other problems get really small real quickly.
Yeah, I agree. If a lot of people...
Sorry, go on.
Go ahead, Virginia, please.
I was going to ask you to talk about, you said that we don't have to pay people individually. There's a way to support artists and intellectuals and creative people. So could you speak?
What I meant is we don't have, so currently the model is that an artist creates something, or a creator or a writer or a scientist, and then they get intellectual property rights in that thing, and then they charge people on the basis of those intellectual property rights, right? And the narrative that we all have imbibed is that the reason for that is because that's the best way to allow that person to capture the full value of what they produced, right? They can put a price on it, they can sell it in the market, and people will pay for it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any value and nobody would pay for it. That's the theory. But there's a very simple way to do something differently, which is to pay people up front. Anyone who's had any experience with something like Kickstarter, I'm not saying that's the perfect way to do things, but people say, you pay us this amount at the outset, we'll produce it, and then you get it on the back end. And in fact, if you look at the way that a lot of creative workers actually exist today, most of them don't actually own their own intellectual property. If you're writing a script for Paramount Studios, do you think you own the intellectual property? Of course not. Paramount Studios own the intellectual property. You get paid a salary. What's something called the work for hire doctrine. It means that if you're an employee of a company, it's the company that owns the intellectual property if you produce it on company dime, right? So Johnson & Johnson, when they come up with their new brand of shampoo and they patent it, it's not some individual scientist that owns that. It's Johnson & Johnson that owns that. And one of the things we see nowadays is a huge amount of actors will get federal or public funding to do research or science or whatever. And then when they make a breakthrough, they will privatize that. They will spin it off. Even something like Google was, they were Stanford graduate students when they started working. And it actually goes back to where copyright began. Because again, most of us think of it as something that was designed to give the creator control. But in fact, it goes back to when the printing press was first created, that the people who invested in printing presses, they were very expensive. It was like investing in a factory, right? Or investing in a tractor. You didn't just invest in it lightly. It was expensive. Once you bought and maintained a printing press, you were damn sure going to use it, right? But the question was what you were going to use it on. If you wanted those things cranking every day, maybe you would be making business materials or wedding materials or smut or politically subversive literature, right? But the assumption in the early 18th century, and then in the United States in particular, was, well, we actually want a more educated populace. We want people to be making culture that will be widely accessible. And the way to do that is to give the creator the ability to sell their rights in their work to the owner of the printing press. And that way, the owner of the printing press will have an incentive to print things that are going to sell to a lot of people, that a lot of people are actually going to read, right? If you print a bunch of business cards for somebody, you don't care if the business fails. They pay you for the business cards and that's it. But if you have an ownership stake in the Harry Potter books when you're printing them, you want as many people to buy Harry Potter books as possible. So the idea was to create a right that the writer, the author had, that they could immediately sell to the printing press owner, so that the printing press owner would not just be a sort of dumb machine like a Kinko's or a FedEx store where you walk in and you print something and you leave and they don't care what you do with it. It would actually become something more like a tastemaker. Their job would be to go out and find the books and to sell the books, which is why publishing houses today, you don't need to go to publishing houses to print a book. What is a publishing house? It's a talent scout. They're looking for the next big book that they can sell. That was the reason why we created those intellectual property rights in the first place, not because we wanted to remunerate the authors. Starving artists were starving before and after the printing press, right? Starving authors were starving before and after the printing press. The reason was to make it so that the interests of the owners of the means of production had aligned interests with the public policymakers who wanted informed electorate. The good news is it's really cheap to do that nowadays. We don't need to align the interests of printing press owners because printing today is as simple as, setting up a blog.
Rohan, could you please angle your laptop a little bit? Thank you. Perfect. Okay, go
Sorry,
on, Ramona.
the camera on my laptop isn't in the low bottom left corner, so it's a very bad angle. I have to sort of put my head down, so apologies for that.
I see. Thank you, though.
So, Ron, you think that if we took intellectual property and we made it available to everyone, and different artists, inventors, creators were able to access it, and learners were able to access it, we would be able to dig ourselves out of the climate crisis?
I don't know. Obviously, the time is ticking and I don't want to trivialize the urgency and the need for mass scale mobilization. So when I said economic planning, the reason I said the Green New Deal is we need a mass mobilization there. We need laws to get rid of brown activities, to build green activities. We need a transition to lower carbon usage of all kinds of things. That's not going to happen just with intellectual property. But what I do know is when we started educating everybody, we fundamentally changed the trajectory of how human society worked and the speed of technological progress, right? When we started giving everyone access to knowledge that was restricted to a limited number of people who could only speak Latin for 1,000 years, we fundamentally changed the way in which politics worked and mass participation in politics worked. We are on the cusp now of releasing, as I said, all scientific information, all cultural information, all cultural production to everybody. And I think that's going to have a massive, massive shift in the way that people understand sort of and think about solving problems together. It's an under-discussed part of the last 12 months, but the fact that we put together a vaccine within 12 months and releasing it to millions of people around the world is a pretty amazing human achievement. And we put someone on the moon in a decade. We did that with computers that are a hundredth of the power of my cell phone. What we can do now, when every child who wants to be a mathematician can learn math, every child that wants to be a musician can learn music, right? Every person who wants to be a biologist can study genetic sequencing and use CRISPR technology with a computer that they can buy at a store. Doesn't have to have specialized equipment. We're in a very different world of science than we were for pretty much the entirety of human history.
Raul has a question.
Yes, good evening, Ramona and Rohan. My question is, according to some estimates, up to 60% of Americans already benefit from government health insurance in some form. Medicare, Medicaid, disability benefits, veterans benefits, and so on. So why is it so difficult to extend government health insurance to the other 40%? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be a health expert. I will say that my understanding is a lot of people will not associate those programs with the government, right? You say, get your government hands off my Medicare, right? There is a disconnect between existing programs and new programs. People are often inherently suspicious or skeptical of new programs, even if they like the existing programs. Part of it is also that those systems have a lot of gaps and a lot of cracks in them and a lot of spaces where private actors glom on and grift. And the simplification in and of itself represents a loss of those opportunities for grifting. So when you have Medicare and Medicaid and Veteran Association stuff, you have service providers that provide data systems to all of them. You have actors that may be part of different networks. You have actors where there's a private insurance company that's providing the last mile of service for some other public system. You have federal funding going to 50 state systems, and each of those state systems has 10 vendors that they have relationships with, right? The act of simplifying them and putting them under a single centralized governance system is in some respects efficiency enhancing, because you're not having all these redundant systems. But when we say efficiency enhancing, what we're talking about there is somebody that benefits from there being two sets of systems having to go away. And those are people who are going to resist it. So on one hand, you have a cultural resistance of average people to something new, or the idea that, you know, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. But you also have this massive institutional resistance where there are just a lot of stakeholders in the economy that have something to lose from moving to a better system, because all of their hands are in the trough right now. And the complexity is part of the point. I'm from Australia, as you can probably tell by my accent. And when I first came to the United States, I used to joke to people, you know, all this tipping, you know, it's such a stupid system of tipping. Well, part of it is obviously just about bad labor standards here in the United States. Part of it is that even often people who get tips don't want to get rid of them because they always see themselves as the exception that proves the rule. Well, tipping is bad for other workers, but I'm in a good position, right? I don't want to change it. But there's also this other point, which is that it makes it harder to actually use prices as anything meaningful. I'm not a sort of free market person that think prices are some amazing signal of information. But when I go to a store in Australia and something costs $8, I pay $8 and I walk away. In New York, when I was living there for almost 10 years, it would say $8, then it would be 8.75% sales tax, and then it would be 15 to 20% tipping on top of that. To do the mental math on a daily basis is almost impossible, unless you're keeping track of everything in a pen and paper on your phone. And once you can't do that kind of math budgeting very easily, it becomes much easier for other actors to grift. Oh, there's $2 surcharge here, sir. Oh, well, we're going to add this on your bill for this reason. And suddenly, what looked like a $100 service, you're paying $108 every time, right? Suddenly, the thing that you go to the store and you see a $5 beer, it's $6.50. And it degrades the idea that you can rely on those prices for anything meaningful. And I think that's the kind of grift at a very meta level that the whole healthcare system is based on. Everybody's screwing with the numbers. Everybody's adding a little bit here. It's like the Master of the House song from Les Mis, you know, charge them for the mice, extra for the lice, 10% for looking in the window twice, right? When that system is complicated, you can hide a lot of grift. And I think that's one of the biggest opposition, is that making it simpler is not in those people's interests.
Ganesh has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So thank you, Ramona, for having me, and great to hear you, Rohan. And I could tell from your accent you're Australian. So my question is, doesn't this chapter highlight that we need an immigration policy that brings in more people as our population declines? Why are we building walls? And also, doesn't it highlight that we need to end incarceration as it exists?
I mean, you'll have no disagreement from me on either of those points. I think there's been some really interesting work recently, and I hope to see more about the idea that the way that we currently pay incarcerated people, these sort of slavery wages, basically, is a violation of the 13th Amendment. And that, certainly the way that we envisage a job guarantee would be to eligible for everybody, including people who are incarcerated. Whether you have to be in jail for other reasons or not does not mean that your rights as a worker should be curtailed, or you should be subject to second-class worker rights citizenship there. In terms of immigrants, I think this is a really, really under sort of developed or under appreciated part of the MMT framework, is that once you realize that humans are the source of value, not a cost, more people in your country is not a bad thing. And it's actually the way to break the mentality of us versus them that you see in so much anti-immigrant nativism, right? Well, we can't afford to pay them, right? It's my tax money. There's a limited amount. I don't want it to pay other people who just come to this country, right? Even if some of them are productive, they're still just draining on our resources. I have family members who say this stuff. It's terrible. And the reality is that a country that is managing its people well will want more people. Anyone that's ever been part of an enterprise that's doing good work is always looking for more people. It's always because there's always more stuff to be done, right? There's actually a book, it isn't out yet, and I only just saw about it, so I can't speak to its content yet. But it's called, I think, modern immigration theory, or maybe modern population theory, or something along those lines. And it's actually someone who has been writing, who's been inspired by MMT. Here we are. It's called A Modern Migration Theory. It's out in March, and I'm extremely excited to read it by a scholar named P.O. Hansen. And they're basically looking at the fact that Sweden opened its borders when a lot of other countries closed it during the austerity crisis of the last 10 years in Europe. And Sweden actually did a lot better than everybody else. And so it builds on MMT to sort of make this point that actually a kind of immigration-friendly labor policy is likely to be net stimulative for your economy overall. So yeah, I think that's the right way of thinking about things. And I think, in fact, it's actually a critical part of getting beyond the sort of us versus them xenophobia that ultimately devolves into fascism almost every time. Eventually, that idea of immigrants are a cost becomes we need to protect our homeland, becomes we need to kill those people. And if we want to stop the descent into fascism, we need to start by recognizing that this country is bigger than its borders, and anybody that comes and is part of that system is a value add.
So, Rohan, what happens now that our government isn't actually taking care of the people that are here at the moment? And then we have more immigrants coming in that are also not being taken care of. Like they're not, like, people who have come here, let's say illegally, are not getting stimulus checks. And they're probably suffering a lot more than everybody else even. And so if our government is actually addressing the issues that we have with the citizens that are already here, how do we extend ourselves to others when we're dropping the ball to begin with?
Yeah. And so the first thing is, I think that the right response is obviously to just not do that to either group, right? That's the sort of obvious and glib response. But two little sort of side points on that. One is, when I was an educator and doing when I was a K-12 educator doing education policy work, there was a lot of debates around standards and high stakes testing. And often high stakes testing, anyone's got kids probably knows this, is often about lowest common denominator kind of stuff, basic literacy, basic numeracy. And interestingly, what a lot of the research suggests is when you try to teach to that low standard, when you try to teach to the test at that low level, students actually do worse on those things than if you teach to a higher standard. Right? It's that sort of old idea that if you shoot for the moon, you'll land in the stars kind of thing. When you set a high standard, it lifts everything. But if you set low expectations, you often don't even meet them. So when it comes to this idea of kind of, we're already struggling, how could we afford to take on more? The reality is, often if we start from that scarcity mindset, I'm sorry, we're too poor, we can't open our doors, we don't have anything to spare. we actually end up with even less than if we open our doors and bring in people. And the other sort of data point that I think is relevant is this comes up a huge amount in the UK. It's a small little island already, 50 million people, it's pretty heavily populated. A lot of people there like to say, oh, you know, the NHS is so crowded. We couldn't have more people come to the UK with the NHS is already overburdened. But the actual reality is that it's immigrants that fund and staff the NHS, not fund in money terms, but are the basis of the NHS. And it is actually often those immigrants that are actually doing the work of keeping the country up. And the same with the United States. If we got rid of immigrant labor tomorrow, the economy would collapse. So I think it's a mistake to think of ourselves as sort of not having enough to go around. The reality is, A, we have more to go around when we're more generous, but B, it is the immigrant workforce that is a value add to that exact problem. If we're suffering from a declining birth rate and we're worried that there's going to be an aging population, well, having more immigrants who can work is actually a good way to address that problem. Japan has been dealing with this right now, and I actually studied Japanese growing up and lived there for a period. One of the problems with a country like Japan is it's the most ethnically homogenous country on the planet. It's very easy to understand why it was able to drift into fascism when it's an island that has spent a lot of its time thinking it's superior to other countries and doesn't let in other ethnic groups very much, right? They're facing the problem right now that they know, and even the conservative, quite xenophobic right-wing government in power right now knows that the best way to deal with their aging population would be to let in younger workers. The problem is that would require making Japan a home for people more than the ethnically kind of Japanese today. And they're going to let their racism shoot themselves in the foot.
Aaliyah has a question. You can unmute, Aaliyah.
Okay, thank you. So obviously, I assume you don't know what's in Greenspan's head, but I was curious, with almost 20 years passing between the two events mentioned in the book, did Greenspan's understanding actually increase from 1983 to 2005 when he was testifying with Paul Ryan, or was he just like messing with Ryan at that point?
I think it's the opposite. I think he was messing with everybody else for 25 years is the short answer. I think Greenspan is one of those people, you know, John Kenneth Galbraith famously said that Milton Friedman had the deep misfortune of living long enough to see his ideas tried in practice. And you know, everybody knows that Greenspan was an acolyte of Ayn Rand and a sort of gold buggy libertarian sort of guy. But the reality is that when you become Fed chair, you can't keep those kinds of juvenile delusions alive anymore. Practically, you're forced to confront the reality of what you're doing, right? So I think, So I think Greenspan knew that the system didn't face financial constraints, but that because he was a right-wing guy and because he believed in markets, he had no reason to make that explicit to people like Bill Clinton, right? He certainly didn't stand in the way of Reagan running deficits, or back when he was a staffer before that. He certainly had no problem with tax cuts if they increased the deficit. He was just your standard right-wing guy who loved to talk about budget balancing and austerity when what he really means is cutting welfare benefits. But the reason I think he's saying that to Paul Ryan is because he's under oath and because he's old enough that he doesn't really care. And I think one of the reasons that Stephanie loves that story is because Greenspan's sort of giving the game away, right? He's supposed to continue to do the thing that he's done for 20 years, which is when he's talking to another right-wing people, to pretend that he's very concerned about the deficit, and the only way to deal with that is to cut, benefits to people. But instead, he just says the quiet part out loud, and it's a sort of amusingly overt moment. But in classic Greenspan way, he uses so much jargon that unless you knew what you're listening for, unless you have a guide like Stephanie, you might not notice that he's saying that other thing.
Margaret has a question. You can unmute.
Hi.
Hello.
Sorry, just scroll. Oh yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure this was addressed earlier in the book, but today there was one sentence uh, where Professor Kelton talked about how we don't get inflation unless we have full employment. I just want to make sure I got that correctly. I'm trying to, because I'm just asking about this because every time I, like on Twitter or whatever, and I'm talking about MMT, and like people immediately respond about, well, what about inflation? And I don't know how to explain it very well.
Yeah, this is a hard topic, and you know, Stephanie, I think, was very careful with her language, and she was very careful in the scope of the book. What she's talking about is inflation resulting from too much demand in the economy, right? And her point is that as long as you're spending that on hiring more people, then that's not going to necessarily be too much money chasing too few goods if you're producing more goods by putting people to work. That said, and I know Stephanie well, I don't think, I don't think I'm sort of putting words in her mouth. I don't think she believes at all that that's the only source of inflation, or even that government spending, public spending, is the only source of demand. So you have this whole world of inflation, possible sources of inflation. Then within that, you have demand-driven inflation. And then within that, you have demand-driven inflation from government spending. And that's the stuff that she's particularly talking about. So to give an example, if you raise the price of oil and the entire economy is dependent on oil, that can have a spillover effect in all other kinds of prices. Gas prices increase the price of this, or oil increases the cost of plastics, which increase the cost of all other kinds of things. So if you increase the price of oil, say you're Saudi Arabia, you could increase overall prices over the entire economy. That has nothing to do with whether there's unemployed people or not. But it also means that the solution to that problem might be to create alternative sources of energy or to find alternative sources of oil. So cutting spending and balancing the budget does not fix that problem. It's an oil problem. It needs an oil solution, right? Another problem could be intellectual property, like I mentioned earlier, right? People have probably heard or even maybe experienced the cost of insulin being hundreds of dollars in the United States, not because that's how much it costs to make insulin, but because of the intellectual property rights around insulin, right? If you change the copyright laws there or the patent laws, the cost of insulin is going to go down. And conversely, if you increase the strength of copyright and patent protections, the cost of those things is going to go up. So if you want to address the pricing issue in the insulin market, cutting government spending is not going to fix it. You need to go to intellectual property laws. The same is true of monopolies or concentrated industries. The same is true on bottlenecks where there's a scarcity of production. Like, for example, right now, there's a bottleneck in the production of semiconductor chips because currently most semiconductor chips are provided by a company in Thailand. So the answer to that problem is to have an industrial policy where you're encouraging the production of semiconductor chips, not to try to cut government spending. So Stephanie's point is particularly that if you want to understand how much government spending is too much, then you need to look at whether it's causing inflation in its own space. But that doesn't mean it's the only source of inflation. And it doesn't mean that every time you see inflation, the answer is to cut government spending, right? Even when you're talking about inflation from there being too much demand, too much spending, one of the things we need to remember is that there are other sources of spending power in the economy. The most obvious is private bank and financial credit. So everyone who remembers Hyman Minsky, who Stephanie mentions in the book, he famously said, anyone can create money. The challenge is to get it accepted. And Stephanie has written elsewhere, she doesn't focus on this book, but she's written elsewhere about how it's not just banks and the government that create money, even though they may be the two most common ones we talk about. It's also shadow banks, right? It's also everything down to, and just to give an example, if you go to a bar and you buy 10 drinks over the evening and you put your card down behind the bar and the bar doesn't swipe your card yet, right? You have the money in your bank account still, $50. The bar is expecting to receive that $50. If they had to do a snapshot of their accounting, it would say, we have $50 coming in. by the end of the night. We're going to record that as an asset because someone owes us $50. But until that settlement happens, until you actually pay your bill, you've created credit there. You've got the $50. You could go out and buy scratchies and try and win the lottery. And if you win the lottery, you come back and you pay for it with the $50 from the lottery winnings, right? Until you settle that bar tab, you've created credit with that bar. If you go to a restaurant, you start eating and the waiter hasn't brought the bill yet, the money exists in your pocket and in the restaurant's pocket. That idea is how banks make money, with a couple of extra wrinkles that mean that their IOU actually then circulates as money as well. But that idea of credit, every space in the economy where there's a time delay, where it's not just a spot transaction where you give me $100 and I give you the thing right there and we walk away. Everything where there's a contract, some settlement that hasn't been made yet, a mortgage, right? We are creating money, creating credit that then has an effect on prices. So if we're worried that there's too much demand out there, one way to deal with that might be to make it harder to create other kinds of private credit, right? If a casino owner wants to make a new casino and the state wants to build a new public school, but we're running out of resources, real resources of concrete and bricks, maybe it makes sense to deny a bank loan to the casino and to grant public spending to the schools so that the bricks and the labor and the construction goes to the school instead of the casino. But we won't have that conversation at all unless we start from the recognition that there are more sources of demand than just government spending, and there is more sources of inflation than just excess demand. We wrote a short little op-ed in the Financial Times, myself, Nathan Tankus, and Scott Fulweiler, after Stephanie's book came out, to help clarify this point, which I highly recommend reading. It's short. It's called an MMT response on inflation, I think. If you look it up, you should be able to find it. An MMT response on what causes inflation. So if you're curious, I would recommend that as a starting point, and I would share that with people.
I'll put that link in the chat.
Thanks.
Thank you, Virginia. Cole has a question.
Hey, first, I just want to thank you for coming out here and spending your time with us, Rohan. It's always much appreciated. Everything you do, we truly appreciate. So just want to get that out of the way. We were talking today about inflation and how, the minimum wage of $15 an hour would affect it. And I was just wondering, I know that's not really part of the chapter, but what are your thoughts? And hopefully we can get something down on video and be able to promote it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that one of the biggest arguments you see against the minimum wage is the idea that it kills jobs, right? And I think that one of the benefits of the MMT framework is it just gets rid of that stupid misconception entirely. If you want to create more jobs, you create more jobs, right? The question of kind of what the right wage scale should be, not just at the bottom, but across the economy, I think is a very difficult political question, right? I would probably prefer, for example, lower wages and more public good provisioning if there's a choice between the two. Usually there isn't. Usually the answer is to argue for both, right? But there are a lot of people that aren't going to be able to work. And so if someone said to me, would you rather have employer-provided healthcare, right, or an employer-provided healthcare credit, or Medicare for all, I would say Medicare for all, no question, right? Because that also works for everybody who's not a worker as well. If you said to me, would you rather pay workers more and then charge them to go to privatized parks, or would you rather pay them less and have more public parks? The answer is more public parks, no question, right? But again, that's not the problem we usually face. Usually the problem is that the only place that people can get work, which they need to survive, is through private employers. And so they will take whatever wage the private employer is willing to give them. But if you have a job guarantee, that just changes the entire dynamic. You don't need to ask private employers what the right wage is. You set the right wage as a matter of public policy, right? The most empowering aspect, in my opinion, of MMT from a worker's perspective is it renders the boss obsolete. If you think about even someone like Marx, right? Marx starts with the idea that workers have been alienated from the means of production, have to sell their labor power to private employers. Well, what happens to that story if you don't have to sell your labor power to private employers, right? That's the kind of question that the job guarantee framework allows us to ask about the minimum wage, that is completely obscured in a world where the only place that jobs come from is the private sector.
I have temporarily lost my screen.
Okay, Ido or Ido has a question. And
Hi, can
Hi.
you hear me? Yeah, thank you for joining us today. I have a question, trying to wrap my mind around the objection to these entitlement programs, because it seems like we are all in agreement, and as Stephanie writes, these programs help so many people, and more than that, it puts money in their pockets that they spend on consumer goods or elsewhere in the economy. So at the end of the day, capitalists, big business, the receiving end of these funds should benefit from it. And, you know, if we're talking about healthcare, so healthy workers are obviously more productive and also can have more money in their pockets to spend more. So from the neoliberal perspective, what is the objection here? Or the other, or another way of asking it is, what is the real reason for the austerity? My thought was maybe private debt that they then financialize and build instruments on top of that. So long questions.
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is relative power is different from absolute value, right? The iron law of institutions is that an institution would rather an actor would rather damage the institution overall to keep their relative power than to give up their relative power to benefit the institution. So if you are the sort of capitalist class or the financier class, the idea that workers would not need you anymore or would not need your money anymore if you're the taxpayer class or the banker class is far more damaging to your long-term interests than the idea that your workforce might be sick or tired or not as productive, right? So it's one of those situations where it sounds like they're acting against their class interest, but in fact, I'd say they're acting entirely consistent with their class interest for the reasons why we want to change things, right? We think that a job guarantee would make workers would make the boss less powerful because you could tell the boss to go fuck themselves. But it's for that exact reason that the boss doesn't like it, right? Even if their workforce is healthier and happier and they got less costs from Medicare and stuff, their workers can tell them to go fuck themselves. They don't want that because in the long term, that's what takes away their power. And so I think that's the big answer. And there's a reason that the Marx story starts with unemployment, right? The only place to get a job is the private employer, the private capitalist. That's their power, is to take your ability to survive without them away. Well, what does neoliberal austerity do? What is Margaret Thatcher's famous line that Stephanie says? There is no public money, there is only taxpayer money. The first thing you do is to take away their ability to support themselves. So now, where do you need to get the money from? From taxpayers, which means white men, or from finance, from credit, which means the financial system. So just like the employment story takes away the ability of us to employ ourselves, that's the starting assumption of the privatizing narrative. The reason you need to go to your boss is because you can't just get a public job. The reason you need to tax or to borrow is because you can't just create money. And that win is the ball game. So my colleague Raul, he likes to tell this story from Gandhi, where Gandhi was organizing with workers in India over a salt mine, and they were sort of trying to take over ownership of the salt mine. And Gandhi said, look, it is incredibly hard to get the money out of the fist of the boss once they have it, but the trick is to never let them close their fist. So if we build a route from the sea where all the salt we can ever have is in the sea. If we can build a pathway there and defend that pathway, we never need to go to the boss for more salt, right? We can make them obsolete. And that is the big shift that I think there's a lot of opposition to, is once we build that pathway to the money power, we don't need those fucking bankers anymore. We don't need the tax money. If we build a road to public job creation, we don't need the private market anymore.
Is that why whenever jobs guarantee comes up, the discussion is always so these will be federally funded jobs, and then they can be moved into the private sector afterwards.
Yeah, I
that
disagree. I disagree with Warren's framing of that, and other MMTers I think disagree with Warren's framing of that as well. So Mosley likes to call them transition jobs, and I've had this argument with him, and he you know, we're not going to agree on that, and that's fine. But in his view, the point is to transition them back out again, and I don't see it that way. I have no problem if somebody wants to stay in public jobs forever, or a job guaranteed job forever. And I think this idea that the private sector is the default starting position is just wrong. It's wrong empirically and it's wrong normatively. So I don't think of job guarantee jobs as transitioning people necessarily back out. But in fact, I would frame it the other way around, is that that it's usually public jobs that come first. In the monetary story, it's usually the army and the scribes and the court administrators, right? The judges and the king's advisors. They're the core public sector. And then you can have private markets and whatever, and then you have unemployment and whatever. But in fact, the first employment circuit from money to a worker, you know, back is the public sector. And I think that's the right way to think about a job guarantee as well. It's just that the neoliberal or the capitalist, you know, strategy is to hide that, is to obscure that behind narratives of markets and of private property and things like that.
Thank you, because that always made me feel uncomfortable, and I couldn't figure out why I felt so uncomfortable with it. But thank you.
Yeah, and you know, as I said, I am grateful that someone who has very different politics to me, like Warren, and I both are in agreement that a job guarantee is a good thing. But I think we both have very different starting points for what kind of economy we want to build. And in his view, have a job guarantee that gets people back out into private market work as quickly as possible. In my view, that's not inherent to a job guarantee.
Warren says that you guys don't like capitalism very much, Rohan.
Well, yeah, sure. I
Yes.
mean, I don't have any opposition to that claim. Yeah. And you know, I'm also not a millionaire banker who lives in the Virgin Islands. So which one of us is more representative of the average experience of capitalism? I'm not sure.
Iker has a question.
I'm having trouble. Oh,
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Hi. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here again, Rohan. So basically, you kind of touched a little bit on my question, but I'm just gonna go ahead and ask it. If we were to implement Medicare for all, and even with the federal government's ability to sustain it, it still bothers me that we have put it into law to remove the government's ability to negotiate and set prices for drugs and procedures. So as we are moving to get Medicare for all implemented, should we still kind of and you talked a little bit about this, about should we pursue to remove this stupid law, or does it become a no point once it's in place in terms of bargaining power in the market?
I think the general assumption, or certainly the way that I've heard people like Bernie and others talk about it, is that that part of the point of having Medicare for all would be to change those negotiations, right? Because you would have a single buyer on the other side of those negotiations. My view would be, yeah, that we would definitely want to go deeper than just having, you know, the same kind of negotiation structure with just a more powerful actor on one side, which is why I kind of mentioned intellectual property earlier, right? Those drug manufacturers, their entire business model is built around patents, right? If you actually start to change the patent system, then you're getting right to the heart of how that entire industry works. So one hand, you could just change the prices by regulation. But at least in my view, the risk there and what you're likely to hear is people will say, well, if you just drive down the prices, we won't be able to operate. And I think that's probably going to be wrong and propagandistic, but that there's not an easy answer to that, right? What you're saying is, well, we think you can do the same amount of work you're doing now, but get less profits. And that may be very well true, but it's also not a provable statement. But if you say, fine, you don't want to make it, well, we'll just publicly invest in making it over here. We will make you obsolete. That is what takes away their leverage in the process. So long term, I don't like the idea we have a private pharmaceutical industry that has all these intellectual property rights that then they charge rents to the government to. That's the problem. We can try to come up with all kinds of negotiation strategies to make the price cheaper. But as long as that's the business model, we're going to keep facing this problem.
Roseanne has a question.
Hi, Rohan. Thanks so much for being here. You know, I'm getting up in years, and what I think about most, I love the discussions. I love sharing MMT articles and information. But what I come back to every day is, what are your thoughts on why people like those of us who are here today, why are we drawn to MMT and so many others don't accept MMT? MMT is, as Bill Mitchell says, and other people want to argue. They wouldn't even pick up Stephanie's book or read something that you've written or something Bill Mitchell has written. So have you, I'm sure you've been thinking about what is it that gets us to take that step to open up our mind to accept MMT?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is like I understand, and you know, I have no problem with people trying to encourage other people to read things, but I also understand why a lot of people are going to be inherently skeptical if somebody tells them to read a whole book. Like there are a lot of topics where I'm not. If somebody said to me, "Keep an open mind, read a book on this," I'm not going to read a whole book. I got other things to do. I'm just not going to do it. If an anti-vaxxer comes to me and says, "Keep an open mind, maybe you'll have your world change. Just read this whole book," I'm not going to do it. And so I think it's reasonable that people have heuristics in their life where until you can demonstrate that you have met some basic heuristic of theirs, that there's a value in what you're saying, they're not going to trust you and invest more time and resources, right? If somebody comes to me in the door and says, "Hi, you know, can I talk to you about Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints?" I'm not going to want to hear anything else they have to say because I know that the kind of person that's doing that, they're not adding value to my life. And so the first step, I think, is that for whatever reason, could be where you are at in your life, could be what you are intellectually primed, could be the way that your brain works, could be the way that somebody said the right thing at the right time. MMT got to you through those defenses that you have, because I think everybody has that kind of defense in some way, even open-minded, curious people. Got through and added value to you in a way that made you want to keep learning. And eventually it broke something in how you look at the world that made you realize that there is a different way of thinking on the other side. It went from being just educational to generative, right? Just like for a lot of people, you know, when they're studying physics or something, and then they study quantum physics, and it breaks something about the way they understand the world. Suddenly, matter isn't just there. It could be there and not there at the same time. And you can't see the world the same way after that. If you get what they're trying to tell you about how, you know, quantum physics and uncertainty and Schrodinger's cat and all that stuff works, you don't have to become a mathematician and learn all the physics, But you do have to realize that what we thought was stable and concrete in the world is not actually that, and that science at that micro level, the micro foam that makes up the universe, has a lot more things to do with magic than it does with the way that we imagine sort of bricks and mortar to work, right? Scientists have gotten now entanglement between two particles that are 100 kilometers away, where you tickle one and the other one laughs, you know? You excite one, the other one exhibits excited properties. 200 miles away, nothing in between them. But they have connected those two in a way that's almost magical. If you're a scientist thinking like that, there's an infinite possibilities of things you're trying to understand. If you think the world is the way that Newton described it, where there's an apple and then there's an atom and the atom is stuff, you're not even waking up thinking about those kinds of questions. So I think part of it is the difference between having a paradigm that fundamentally alters how you see things. But the other part is that it's very hard to be in the right place receptively to such a big idea. Sometimes one can get through under the armor. Sometimes you just happen to be in the right time, the right place. But a lot of people are also just emotionally not able to deal with it. It's a big idea. If you've lived your entire life on the basis of scarcity, that you think that the way, you know, your parents denied you food because they needed you to understand that you need to pay your way, right? What you're telling them in that moment is not just some abstract shit about how government budgets work. You're challenging their entire worldview that the world is scarce and we have to be dog against dog, man against man. It's a zero-sum game. When you pay Peter, you have to rob Paul. That is as confronting to some people as questioning whether God is dead or whether quantum physics means that we don't have a stability of matter in the world.
I think this is a really interesting question that Roseanne brought up, because I kind of worked backwards. So I somehow intrinsically always knew this and felt this and used to speak about how there's more than enough, that we can work together and figure it out and take care of everyone. And there's no need for the suffering. And I used to talk about this as a child. And my family used to say to me, you know, Ramona, if your ideas ever come true, Earth would be like heaven. And so when I found MMT, I said, oh, wow, here is something that economists are speaking about, that's being taught in universities, that I can express my thoughts, my ideas in a way that other people could finally accept it. So
yeah, and I have students in my classes now at law school who they say, you know, I get into class and they say, what's going to be on the exam? And then they say, what's going to be on the bar exam when I graduate? And if you deviate from those things in class, they think you're wasting their time. And if I try to explain to them that, in fact, the bar exam is a very bad reflection on what you should know to be a good lawyer, and that if I only taught you it's in the bar exam, you'd be wasting your education. You could just go read it in a book, right? Or if I told them that the final exam is something that I don't think is actually a good measure of learning, but I have to do because the university imposes it on me, they're not going to hear that, right? Half of them are not going to hear that at all. Half of them may hear it if I put the work into building a relationship, so they're primed to hear something from me and take it seriously, even if it contradicts their entire worldview. But I can't take that personally. There's no point, there's no value in taking that personally, right? If you ask somebody, if you're sitting there looking at someone getting frustrated that they're not getting MMT yet, it's not a useful use of your time and emotional energy, any more than imagine an anti-vaxxer is going, oh, why don't they get it? They don't get it because you're crazy. Now, maybe we're all crazy. I don't think we are. And I think the reality has proved to us that we're actually more correct than not. But you got to remember that from the outside, there's no difference between us and anti-vaxxers to the other person. They have no reason to trust a fringe heterodox movement. And all the like, well, just read this article or just read this book or just keep an open mind. All the stuff that you can say there is not going to get past that initial, why the hell should you have anything valuable to tell me? Because their assumption, a lot of those people, is if it was valuable, someone I already trust would have told it to me. I remember one of my ex-girlfriends, you know, we had a mutual friend, which is how we knew each other. And he was a banker. And I'd have these arguments with him every day about this stuff. And, you know, he's a smart guy. He's open-minded. He heard me out. It's not that he sort of thought there was some immediate smackdown. but he was a very deferential person. He liked to defer to the group. He liked to seem like he was in the middle of the line. He'd say to his friends, well, look, just tell me who I should vote for. Who's the right Democrat? I'll vote for them, right? He's that kind of guy. He doesn't want to be a bad guy, but doesn't like going out of the pack. And she said to me, and she was 100% right. She said, you're going about this all wrong. You want to convince him? You convince his best friend. Because his best friend is the one that he'll listen to. He's never going to listen to you. He thinks his best friend knows more about finance than he does. They both work on Wall Street, but he thinks his best friend is the finance genius. If you convince him, he'll go along because he doesn't think for himself. So you're trying to convince a sheep to act like a leader. They're not going to do it. Find the leader, convince them, and then go backwards from there. So when you're going out and you're trying to talk to your friends or talk to your family members or go to your local, Rotary Club, whatever, and it's not getting through, it's probably because you're not using the strategy that's appropriate to the moment. And you can get frustrated that they don't see the light, as I'm sure every evangelical for every cause has been throughout history. Or we can work out what's going to be effective, who that other person is you need to be convincing to get to that person. Maybe the answer is you just got to hang out with them and talk about other random shit for 10 weeks first. Maybe the answer is you have to rewrite the same damn article that you're trying to get them to read in a conversational thread. And maybe you don't want to waste that energy. Maybe you do. But the art of persuasion is to take responsibility on your side to get to the persuasion point. It's not their job to immediately find everything you say credible. And I'm not saying that as to lecture anybody about, to admonish anybody, but in my experience, it's a much more productive use of your time.
Well, that we're committed to media because we think that if people hear about it enough, that it's sort of the most efficient way for us to get the message out there. Ramona works with candidates and is actually planning to do an interview show with candidates who are learning MMT or open to MMT, because there's this sense that if you're reading about it more and hearing about it more, it's what you just said. If other people seem to be believing in it, then maybe I can believe in it too.
Yep. And there's that's completely right. And the answer is, I think it takes a multiplicity of strategies. There's no one way you're going to convince everybody, right? You could give the most brilliant speech of all time, and probably 40% of an audience is going to think it's complete bullshit if the audience is big enough. No matter how good the speech is, Sermon on the Mount, half the people walked away going, oh, that Jesus guy sounds like a charlatan, right? Obama's speech in 2004, half the people walked away thinking he was a Muslim terrorist, right? The point is, no matter how good you are with any particular medium or strategy, you're only going to capture some fraction of the overall people you're reaching. So there are some, hitting 10,000 people with a media strategy, if you get 400, that's 400. That's a good number. But getting frustrated that the 9,600 didn't get it is probably missing the point. Maybe a better media strategy would have got 800 instead of 400 out of 10,000. But it doesn't mean that you failed. It just means there's no one strategy that's going to get all 10,000. It's just not the point. And that, again, even with media, there's certain people that no matter what you guys do at Real Progressive will never have their mind changed by an organization like yours, whereas one New York Times article is going to do the world of difference. That's not because you're doing anything wrong. It's because that's who they are. And that's where their worldview is, right? Or one friend is going to suggest they read something and they're going to trust that friend. Maybe it's going to be their girlfriend or someone they're trying to hook up with, right? And they're going to read it because they want to impress that person. And they're going to finally pay attention for the first time on economics that they never bothered to care about until then. You shouting them on Facebook? Nah, they didn't give a shit. Someone they want to sleep with? Oh, okay, now they're paying attention. Now they're doing their homework. Who knows, right? The point is, I think you do the best job you can with the tools and the skills and the strategies you have, but don't lose sleep over the ones you don't catch. There's so many more out there to catch.
I find that
an aphrodisiac will be happy.
Yeah.
I find that candidates are very much receptive to this, and they're just waiting for the next person to go first publicly. And so they all, I put them in groups and I send them all the info and nobody leaves. So they're reading the info. But nobody's ready to take the first step to like except Jason Call, but Ashcraft, right? What was her first name?
Lauren.
Lauren, thank you, Lauren Ash. Like there are a few that are willing to take that first step, but everybody's always waiting for somebody else to go first.
Maybe we should be advertising on Pornhub.
I mean, you joke, but part of it is also that that it's often hard in a politician's position to do all of the work to make that work, right? Like, it's one thing to say Lauren and I supported her candidacy, but she also didn't win, right? And so it's one thing to say we've got politicians that have done that. It's another thing to say we've got politicians that have done that and won. And you need the first one to achieve the second, but it doesn't mean that, like, if somebody said, if Bernie had said this and been laughed out of the room, would we be in a better place now? I don't actually know if the answer is yes. I don't actually know if the answer is yes. That I'm not saying that he couldn't have potentially done it effectively, but I'm not actually sure if trying to fit a square peg through a round hole doesn't end up being more net negative sometimes than net positive. Now, if we got someone like Cardi B to do a fucking song about it or something, I trust her artistic skills that she would convey that, right? That's that kind of thing might actually be much more valuable long term than any one politician saying it, because that you can say with art what you can't say with prose, right? But you can also get people in a different way, right? If Rashida Tlaib, for example, when I worked with her on the Mint the Coin Act, the reason that we did the Mint the Coin thing there, right? It's not necessary, and there are a whole bunch of other bills that we want to fund, but we didn't do a Mint the Coin for every single one. The reason we did it for that one was because why? That was a bill to give every single person $2,000 a month. If there's ever a time when the average person is going to be primed to hear an argument about financing, it's in the middle of a recession where you're proposing giving them cash in their pocket. So that was a very strategic decision of why to do it with that bill and not other bills. It wasn't just, oh, we finally found a politician who's willing to say that. I wouldn't have asked her to say it for other bills in different ways. In that moment, in that opportunity, absolutely.
I remember Ice-T spoke about MMT a few times on Twitter. And it was Ice Cube, thank you. And it was all the rage, but nothing more came of it.
Yeah, and then Ice Cube went and met with Trump's team about a black agenda, right? And so it's one of those moments where the other problem with relying on individual politicians there, apart from the fact that they're often a lagging indicator of change, not a leading indicator of change, is that you live and fall with the rest of that politician, right? It's sometimes better to have no champions, because then you can't have your champion let down your movement, right? One good thing about this movement is, if I get hit by a bus, Warren gets hit by a bus, hell, if even Stephanie gets hit by a bus tomorrow, it's not going to stop this movement from rolling along. There is no one leader that the whole thing depends on. And the good news about that means it's a lot more resilient. But the minute you start building it around a single politician, you run that risk.
Like AOC, one day she's a queen, the next day she's a traitor.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe the answer is that she was neither.
Exactly.
Maybe the answer is she's a politician trying to push the needle from one position, and that position has benefits and limitations. And the disappointment that many people experienced was probably because they were trying to make her into something that she couldn't or wasn't going to be. And some of the reasons people like her is because they were pleasantly surprised that in her position, she could do things that they didn't think someone in that position could. And that to me is the differential. It's that old line of the sort of knowing what you can change and what you can't, and the wisdom to know the difference, right?
Michael has a question.
Michael, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, maybe he's distracted. I'll ask for him until he comes on. Aren't we already publicly funding pharma and letting them keep the spoils and profits, worst of all worlds?
I mean, the short answer is yes. And, on one hand, that was what I was saying with university funding. And we see this with other spaces, right? Right now, you get funding from a university to do research, and then you publish it on Elsevier, and then Elsevier charges people $50 to access the article, right? it happens with all sorts of creative work as well. You know, you fund people to do something at a public organization, and then they kind of go out and they privatize whatever they make from it. But yeah, I think, you know, people like Dean Baker and others have been talking about this for years. And in fact, my master's thesis was on the macroeconomics of culture and intellectual property, but from a kind of synthesizing Dean Baker's work with MMT more on these issues. And I think it's completely correct. And when we wrote about the Green New Deal and how to pay for the Green New Deal, one of the things that we talked about was sort of, we were pushing back against this idea that we should use public banks to do the whole thing, because when you do it with lending, right, you have to pay it back, which means the projects that have a likely chance of return on investment become the more attractive projects rather than the ones that had the best social return. But the other thing is that this idea of sort of, imagine how much money the US could make if we had the US lead the Green New Deal and then create all these interesting technologies that it could sell to the rest of the world, right? This was Elizabeth Warren's America First strategy. And on one hand, it's just straight up imperialism. But on the other hand, it's also the way that you build that model is through intellectual property and rent seeking, right? The government is funding that work, but they're deliberately keeping it from people in India so that they can charge Indians on top of whatever they, you know, even if they gave it to every American for free, we're not going to give it to foreigners for free. Well, fuck that, frankly. You know, this is information and knowledge and science should be available to the whole of mankind. Even after you get to the idea that it's publicly funded, it should go to that public. It's also a commons. It shouldn't be owned by any country or any government. And that's why I think, you know, movements like the free software movement and the Creative Commons movement are the right way to go, because they not only make it shareable and non-owned, non-proprietary, but they do so in a way that doesn't allow governments to extract that value at the expense of everybody else.
Christina has a question. You can unmute yourself, Christina.
She might not be able to talk.
Okay, I will go ahead and ask for her. Speaking of legislation and lawmakers, please talk about the stable coin, tethering, and bank licensing enforcement. Stable Act.
Yeah, so I wrote this with Congresswoman Tlaib's office and my collaborator Chastity Murphy, who's recently left that office, but was a great legislative economic policy advisor. And the idea was that there's this sort of tendency that people like Hyman Minsky talked about a lot that isn't in Stephanie's book that much because she was focusing on public money. But the other part of the MMT story about how banks work and how shadow banking works is that there's always actors trying to create things that walk and talk like money, that are as safe as money, that seem to be as safe as money, without getting the level of government oversight and protection so that they will actually have that value in a crisis. So we had that with banks before bank deposit insurance. We had that with what they call money market mutual funds, MMMFs, in the 2008 crisis, where they would issue these shares that would function like a dollar, but in a crisis moment weren't worth $1, and the government had to bail out the money market funds like they bailed out the banks before 1930s when they enacted deposit insurance. So there's this long history of private actors who really want to engage in bank activities. And by bank activities here, what I mean is banking in the sort of sense that my advisors Sally Omarova and Robert Hockett talk about the bank as a franchise of the government, right? It's like a sheriff's deputy. They're wearing the deputy badge and they can go out and issue public money that's backed by the government, but it's sort of delegated to these banking actors. The way that we've designed that system, and I have no problem changing that system. The way we've designed it now is that those commercial banks can create government-backed money in exchange for having to get a bank license and being subject to more aggressive regulatory oversight than an average corporation, right? To get a bank license is a difficult process and requires you to be at the mercy of regulators a lot more than a regular corporation. Which is why if you're a private actor and you could create money and get all the benefits of being a bank without any of the regulatory compliance costs, well, that's a double win for you. So there's always this margin around the licensed banking system of sort of gray shadow actors that are doing very bank-ish activity without all of the supervision of banks. And the new version of that is the issuance of digital assets, sometimes called cryptocurrencies, sometimes called other things, but usually called stable coins nowadays, that unlike Bitcoin or unlike other private currencies, are designed to have a fixed value in the US dollar, right? So it's 1-to-1, or it could be 2-to-1 or something like that. And the idea is, whereas a Bitcoin is almost like a different unit of account. It's almost like a foreign exchange rate conversion, right? The US to the euro, the US to Bitcoin. Whereas in this situation, it's like a bank deposit to a dollar bill. They're both denominated in US dollars. And the only question is, are they equally safe? Well, before we had deposit insurance and the Federal Reserve System, you would take a banknote in New York and you would pay something for $10 and you give them a $10 banknote and they would say, that bank is risky. I'm going to give you $6 for that $10 note. I'm going to discount it by 40%. And that takes into account the risk. So that idea is exactly what the shadow banks are trying to avoid. They want to take their $10 note in and it to be as close as $10 as possible. They don't want it to be worth $6. Stable coins are a version of digital assets that are trying to do the same thing. Half of them claim they have the money stored in a bank. They don't usually have it stored in a bank, or they're lying, or even if they are stored in a bank, it creates a secondary layer of risk because the bank can only insure those dollars up to $250,000. So in other countries where they had mobile money systems, where the mobile money operators, the telecom companies, would be built on top of banks, they address this problem either by combining them, requiring the telecom company to get a bank license, or giving the telecom company an account at the central bank directly so they could skip the bank layer. What the Stablecoin Act was saying was, let's call a spade a spade. What these stable coins are is shadow bank money. So we should regulate them as banks. We shouldn't wait for the crisis and then bail them out, which is what we always do. We should learn the lesson of history and regulate these things as banks from day one. So you can think about MMT on one hand, saying we should have a more expansive use of the public monetary power. On the other hand, we should more aggressively regulate and tighten our control over private finance. And that's what the Stablecoin Act is about.
Rohan, I promised you that you could leave at 7:45. However, there are two more questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, two more is fine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Aaliyah, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. So I was just in this chapter we read on page 172, Goldwater was denouncing the idea of Medicare, and he said that he was fearful of lines of old folks at hospital doors, et cetera, et cetera. And if this is the expected result, which I think we still have some of this now, isn't it an admission that the current system isn't working, that there's a pent-up demand for healthcare or other things that aren't being met?
Yeah, so people often say, "Oh, the criminal justice system is broken," right? And then the response, which I sort of sympathize with more, is it's not broken. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do, right? It's not broken that it's incarcerating black men at 6 times the rate of others. That's what it was designed to do. There's a reason that system came into being the minute slavery ended, right? And if you think about the way that we talk about the healthcare market, when we say pent up demand there, well, demand that isn't backed by money, from someone like Goldwater's point of view, isn't real demand, right? If you don't have the money to do, everybody wants a unicorn and fairy dust and a pony, right? There's an unmet demand amongst young children for ponies, but they can't afford it. So that's not real demand. That's just wishes and hopes and dreams, right? So I think, implicit in a lot of the right-wing market logic is social Darwinism. Part of the point of the market is to ensure that the undeserving don't get what they don't deserve. Right? That if we create a rugged system, then the deserving will get things, and the others, well, that's unfortunate, but that's the price we pay for freedom. The alternative is I have to be my brother's keeper, not just by my own voluntary charity on the weekends when I go to church with other people who look like me, but I've actually got to be every one of my brother's keepers, including the bad ones, and they don't want that. That's not their vision of a society. Their vision of a society is one where you look after your own. You may help other people beyond that if you feel you can, but that's up to you and God. And beyond that, you don't owe them shit. If they die in the ditch, so be it. And remember, when Goldwater says, you know, we can't afford to subsidize those other people, you know, we know exactly who he's talking about. It doesn't mean people who look like me, right? Goldwater was at the heart of the realignment of the South, where the right wingers picked up all of those racists, right? The Goldwater narrative was an explicit dog whistle about the white taxpayer not wanting to pay for those other undeserving people. And it was a short jump and a step from Goldwater in 64 to Reagan in 1980 talking about welfare queens. Right? And it's the same reason that a lot of us MMTers, we oppose the use of the term taxpayer money, because then it puts the taxpayer in this vaunted position. Well, Goldwater is one of those taxpayer money guys. He was saying Margaret Thatcher's line before Margaret Thatcher was, right? In many respects, I think Margaret Thatcher was inspired by Goldwater. She certainly cited him as an influence, right? So this idea that we can't afford to look after everybody, what they really mean is, I don't want my white man money going to those black people who should be dying anyway because they're lazy and stupid. That's what he's saying. In code, not particularly good code, certainly by Nixon, they weren't even trying to be particularly coded about it. But that's what he's really saying there. And when it comes to the question about sort of underneath all of that, to your point, yeah, the reality is if you want to provide a public good to everybody where there's more need for it than availability, the only way we do that is through rationing. It's the way that we did it in World War II. It's the way that we do it with healthcare. It's the way that we do it with public education. We ration. So it's always a question of rationing on in what way. And the way that the market advocates believe is you ration according to how much money you have. Others of us think that there are more egalitarian ways to ration, but it's always rationing at some point.
And ask Christina's question. Related to paying into Social Security or the system, how do we begin a tax reform? As is, contractors, freelancers seem to be dinged twice or three times.
Well, I mean, the first step I think is to move all of those mandatory spending programs into the public fisc. Get rid of the trust funds, they're unnecessary, right? The second thing is to do an overall tax code reform where you ask those questions that sort of people like Beardsley Rummel and the MMT has put up about what's the purpose of the tax? What are you trying to achieve, right? If there's no reason to impose a payroll tax that's regressive, get rid of it. Just get rid of it. Put the employee side payroll tax to zero. That's it, done. So I think the answer is, you know, we fund it directly. We stop imposing taxes for stupid reasons, and you know how much you do that piecemeal or comprehensive will depend on how much political power you have. But the short answer is they're good things to spend on, so we should spend on them. It's that simple. We don't need this, like, you know, FDR thought it was smart politics to say we have to pay into it, therefore nobody will want to get rid of it. That might have been true for 5 minutes. It hasn't been true for a very long time. And the broader question of kind of, well, what is that actually the best way to impose taxes for whatever reasons we want to impose taxes? Well, maybe some of those taxes will survive that review, but my guess is a lot of them wouldn't.
Thank you so much, Rohan. I have learned so much, and all of us have learned so much. This has been fantastic, beyond fantastic. We really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. You can find more of these recordings at realprogressives.org. There's one for each chapter. Go to the media menu and look for the RP Book Club. While you're there, be sure to check out the Macro and Cheese podcast and a wide range of other materials on MMT and other progressive issues. Thanks for joining us.